The mop bucket tipped first, and the gray water spread across the marble lobby floor in a slow spreading fan, catching the reflection of the chandelier above, like something breaking apart in a mirror. Grant Harrison stood frozen with his hand still on the handle, watching Claire Whitmore's face shift from irritation to something colder, something final, as three junior executives paused halfway to the elevator bank to watch. She had a tablet in one hand, and her voice, when it came, was low enough that it should have stayed private, except the lobby at 6:40 in the morning carried sound the way empty rooms always do. "You've been late 4 times this month," she said. "You knock over supplies. You wander into restricted floors like you own them. I don't know what kind of operation the cleaning contractor is running, but I won't have it in my building." She did not raise her voice. She never did. That was the thing people who worked for Claire Whitmore learned fastest. The quieter she got, the more finished the conversation already was. "You're done. Turn in your badge at security on your way out." Grant did not argue. He looked at the water pooling around his shoes, at his own badge clipped to a gray uniform shirt that had never once, in 11 weeks, borne his real name, and he said nothing at all. Behind Claire, unnoticed by either of them, the elevator doors opened, and a small, sharp-eyed woman in a cream-colored coat stepped out and stopped mid-stride, her mouth opening slightly at the sight of the mop, the spreading water, and her own son standing in the middle of it, with his badge already coming unclipped in his fingers. To find out how a billionaire's heir ended up fired from his own family's company by the woman running it, stay until the very end. If stories about people who are underestimated before anyone bothers to really look at them mean something to you, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. So many of you watching have lived some version of this yourselves. And here's a question worth sitting with before we go back to the beginning. When a founder's family holds onto real power quietly, out of sight, is that protecting a company's soul? Or is it just another kind of corporate secrecy dressed up as loyalty? You can decide for yourself as this story unfolds. 11 weeks earlier, none of this existed. There was no gray uniform, no mop, no badge with a false name laminated onto it. There was only a modest apartment on the west side of the city, a 6-year-old girl named Emma, who still slept with the hallway light on, and a father who had spent the 2 years since his wife died learning how to braid hair badly, and how to disappear into a life so quiet that almost nobody who met him would have guessed what he used to be. Grant Harrison had once been the presumed future of Harrison Industrial Group, the sprawling manufacturing and logistics company his mother, Eleanor Harrison, had built from a single leased warehouse 40 years earlier into a corporation worth $11 billion, with 14,000 employees across 6 states. He had trained under her personally. He had a mind for systems, for supply chains, for the kind of operational detail that most executives paid consultants to explain to them in simplified language. And then his wife had died in a car accident on a rain-slick overpass 18 months into Emma's life. And something in Grant had gone quiet in a way that never fully came back. He had stepped away from the company, not fired, not forced out, simply gone, trading boardrooms for school pickup lines, telling himself and everyone else that Emma needed a father who was present, not a father who was building an empire 200 miles away from bedtime. Eleanor Harrison had let him go without a fight, because she understood grief better than most people gave her credit for. She had buried a husband of her own, decades earlier, and she knew that some wounds could not be argued out of a person, only waited out. But Eleanor was 76 years old now, and the company she had built was rotting quietly from the inside. And she had spent the better part of a year watching reports arrive on her desk that did not add up. Inventory shrinkage that outpaced any reasonable theft ratio, safety incidents buried under reclassified paperwork, a logistics division bleeding nearly $9 million a year that nobody could adequately explain. She had hired auditors. The auditors had found nothing conclusive because the people doing the hiding were smart enough to hide from auditors. What she needed was someone who could walk the floors unnoticed, who understood the systems well enough to see what didn't belong, and who nobody currently working at Harrison Industrial would recognize. Her son, who had not set foot in the corporate offices in 4 years, who had grown a beard and lost the crisp-tailored look of the man who used to run pilot programs at 26, fit that description with an exactness that felt, to Eleanor, almost like fate handing her a gift she didn't deserve. She drove to his apartment on a Tuesday evening in March, sat at his kitchen table while Emma showed her a drawing of a horse with too many legs, and asked her son to come back to the company. Not as an executive, not as her son, but as a janitor on the night cleaning crew, working under a false name, reporting only to her, for as long as it took to find out who was stealing from the company he was supposed to inherit. Grant said no twice before he said yes. He said yes because Eleanor mentioned, quietly and without theatrics, that the pension fund for warehouse workers had been quietly underfunded for 3 years, running by someone with executive-level access, and that real people, men and women with families like his own, stood to lose retirement money they had been promised. He said yes because some part of him, the part he had buried under bedtime stories and packed lunches, still ached for the kind of work that mattered on a scale bigger than one apartment. And he said yes, finally, because Eleanor promised him something specific. Whatever he found, whatever it cost, Emma would never know a version of her father that wasn't steady, wasn't safe, wasn't there in the morning to make her cereal. 2 weeks later, a man named Gary Holt, badge photo slightly blurred, employment history thin and unremarkable by design. References that would check out because Eleanor had arranged them personally. Reported for his first overnight shift on the cleaning crew of Harrison Industrial Group's downtown headquarters. 41 floors of glass and ambition that Grant's own mother had built and that Grant himself, 7 years earlier, had once been groomed to run. He did not expect to encounter the company's CEO before his second week was finished. He especially did not expect that CEO to be 34 years old, sharper than anyone he'd worked under in his old life, and entirely unaware that the man buffing the floor outside her office at 11 at night had once sat 2 seats down from his mother in board meetings that decided the fates of thousands. Claire Whitmore had been brought in 18 months earlier by the board, over Eleanor's quiet reservations, to modernize a company that had grown sluggish under long tenure and comfortable habits. She was exactly what the board wanted. Harvard MBA, a reputation for turning around 2 mid-cap manufacturers before she was 30, a management style built on data, discipline, and an almost total absence of patience for excuses. She worked 80-hour weeks. She trusted very few people because in her experience, trust was usually how companies got robbed. And she had inherited, along with the CEO title, a set of division heads and regional managers who had been quietly protecting their own small empires of fraud for years, feeding her reports so polished that even her formidable instincts hadn't yet caught the rot underneath. Grant noticed it almost immediately, in the way only someone who had once built these systems could notice. A loading manifest that didn't match the trucks, a maintenance budget that ballooned every 3rd quarter, with no matching work orders. A night shift supervisor named Pete Doyle, who was unfailingly kind to Grant in the break room, and unfailingly absent whenever inventory numbers needed explaining. Grant said almost nothing to anyone. He emptied trash cans. He learned the rhythms of the building the way he had once learned its financial statements, quietly, thoroughly, and with a memory that missed almost nothing. He also, without meaning to, began noticing Claire Whitmore. The light in her office still on past midnight, 3 nights out of 5. The particular exhaustion in the set of her shoulders when she thought no one was watching. The way she said, "Thank you" to the security guards by name but never once looked twice at the man mopping outside her door. She did not know his name was not Gary. She did not know he had once run a pilot logistics program that saved the company $4 million in a single fiscal year. To Claire Whitmore, he was simply part of the furniture of the building she was fighting to save. And that, more than anything else, was about to become a problem neither of them saw coming. The trouble started on a Thursday, 7 weeks into Grant's assignment, over something so small it would have been laughable if the stakes hadn't already been building underneath it for months. A supply closet on the 14th floor had gone missing nearly $6,000 in equipment over 2 quarters. Laptops that were logged as damaged and disposed of, but never actually destroyed. The serial numbers instead resurfacing on second-hand resale sites that Grant had started tracking on his own laptop at home, late at night, after Emma was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet enough for him to think like the analyst he used to be. He had found a pattern. Pete Doyle's signature was on every disposal form. And on the Thursday in question, Grant had lingered 15 minutes past the end of his cleaning route on the 14th floor, not touching anything, just looking, cross-referencing what he already suspected against the actual layout of the storage room, when Claire Whitmore came around the corner on her way to an early call and found him standing motionless in a supply closet that had no earthly reason for a janitor to be inside at that hour. She did not yell, she never yelled. But her voice, when she asked him what exactly he thought he was doing in a restricted equipment room after his shift had technically ended, carried an edge that made two employees down the hall stop and look. Grant, caught between the truth he couldn't tell her and a lie he didn't have ready, said only that he'd noticed some discrepancies and wanted to check something. It was, in its way, the most honest thing he could have said, and it was also, to Claire, the single most suspicious sentence a night cleaner could possibly utter. "You wanted to check something," she repeated, and something in her exhaustion, in the 18 months of fighting an invisible rot she couldn't fully name, curdled into a sharper suspicion than the moment probably deserved. She had spent a year and a half being lied to by people far more sophisticated than a night janitor. And here was a man standing in a restricted room with no explanation that made sense, at a company that had been bleeding money she couldn't account for. She didn't know his name was Grant. She didn't know his mother had built the building they were standing in. She only knew that trust, in her experience, was how companies got robbed, and this, a stranger in a supply closet, offering half an explanation, was exactly the kind of thing her instincts had been trained to catch. She reported the incident to building security that same morning, and though nothing was formally proven, a note went into Gary Holt's thin, mostly fabricated employment file. Unauthorized access. Insubordinate response. Pattern of concern. It was the kind of note that on its own might have blown over. But it didn't blow over, because 3 days later, the actual breaking point arrived in a way that had nothing to do with supply closets at all. Eleanor Harrison had scheduled a rare, quiet visit to the downtown office. Publicly framed as a routine founder's walkthrough, privately intended as a check-in with her son to see what he'd found. She arrived at 6:15 in the morning, before most of the staff, planning to meet Grant in the loading dock stairwell, where they'd arranged their check-ins away from cameras that covered the main floors. But her car was delayed in traffic, and by the time she reached the building, the lobby was already filling with the earliest arrivals, Claire Whitmore among them, moving through her morning the way she moved through every morning, with a tablet in one hand and a schedule already 3 items deep. Grant, finishing the tail end of his shift, was crossing the lobby with a mop bucket when Claire intercepted him near the reception desk. Not about the supply closet this time, but about something that had happened overnight. A burst pipe on the 2nd floor that the facilities contractor claimed the night crew had failed to report in time, resulting in standing water that had damaged a bank of new server equipment. It wasn't Grant's fault. He had in fact reported the leak the moment he noticed it, through the proper channel, to a supervisor who happened to be Pete Doyle, who had done nothing with the report because doing something with it might have drawn scrutiny to the maintenance budget he'd been quietly padding for a year. None of that context reached Claire. What reached her was a facilities manager's incident report with Gary Holt's name attached to a 4-hour gap between the leak's likely start time and its eventual discovery, and a CEO who had not slept more than 5 hours a night in 11 days, standing in a lobby with a board call in 90 minutes and a mounting, specific dread that the company she'd been brought in to fix was still hiding things from her at every level, including, apparently, the night janitorial staff. "You've been late 4 times this month," she said, and it wasn't precisely true, but it was close enough to true that Grant didn't correct her. "You knock over supplies. You wander into restricted floors like you own them. I don't know what kind of operation the cleaning contractor is running, but I won't have it in my building. You're done. Turn in your badge at security on your way out." The mop bucket went over, Grant's hand catching the handle wrong as he stepped back, the water spreading across the marble in that slow gray fan, and it was in that exact moment, water pooling around her son's shoes and Claire Whitmore's voice still hanging cold in the lobby air, that Eleanor Harrison walked through the revolving doors and stopped dead, watching the entire scene complete itself, half a second too late for her to stop it. Grant did not look at his mother. He did not defend himself. He unclipped the badge that said Gary Holt and set it gently on the reception desk, the way a man sets down something he never much liked carrying. And he walked out through the same doors his mother had just come through, past a security guard who murmured an awkward goodbye, into the gray, ordinary light of a Thursday morning, leaving behind a CEO who had just fired, without knowing it, the true heir to the $11 billion company she'd been hired to save. If you've ever been misjudged by someone who had no idea who you really were or what you were actually carrying, we imagine a lot of you watching tonight know exactly what that feels like. And we'd be honored to hear about it in the comments, whenever you're ready to share it. 8 months would pass before Eleanor Harrison worked up the courage to tell Claire Whitmore the truth she should have told her from the very beginning. But that morning, standing frozen just inside the revolving doors, all she felt was the particular specific horror of watching her son walk away for the second time in his life, and knowing this time at least that she was the one who had put him there. It was not 8 months in the end. Eleanor had said it to herself in the lobby that morning as a kind of penance, a number that felt appropriately heavy for the mistake she'd let happen. But the truth arrived faster than that, because guilt, once it takes root in a person like Eleanor Harrison, does not sit quietly for long. She did not confront Claire immediately. She went instead to her son's apartment that same evening, found him at the kitchen table, helping Emma glue macaroni onto a paper plate shaped like a sun, and sat with him for nearly 2 hours saying almost nothing. Because there was nothing to say that would undo what had happened, and because some part of her recognized that Grant, in his stillness, in the careful way he kept gluing macaroni without his hands shaking, was handling the humiliation the same way he'd handled his wife's death, by absorbing it quietly, privately, and refusing to let it touch the 6-year-old across the table from him. "I could tell her tomorrow," Eleanor said finally, once Emma had gone to bed. "The whole thing. Who you are, what you found." "Don't," Grant said. It was the first full sentence he'd offered all evening. "Not yet. If you tell her now, everything I found gets buried in the story of me getting fired. Doyle finds out I was never really gone. He covers his tracks in a week." He was quiet a moment, turning a mug of coffee slowly on the table. "Let me finish it first. Then you tell her whatever you want." Eleanor agreed, though it cost her something to do it, because every day she waited was a day Claire Whitmore believed she'd fired a negligent night janitor instead of the son of the company's founder, and Eleanor Harrison had built her entire life around never letting an injustice sit longer than necessary. But she trusted her son's instincts about the investigation more than she trusted her own instinct toward immediate correction. And so she waited, and in the waiting, something began to shift inside the building itself, in ways neither of them had engineered. Claire Whitmore did not sleep well the week after firing Gary Holt. It was a small thing, in the scheme of a company she was still trying to save. One night cleaner, replaced within 48 hours by an agency temp who left the 14th floor visibly worse than she'd found it. And yet it sat with her in a way that surprised her. She kept replaying the man's face in the lobby, the way he hadn't argued, hadn't raised his voice, had simply set his badge down and walked out like a man who had expected exactly this outcome and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. Guilty people did not usually look like that. Guilty people argued, deflected, produced excuses. This man had looked, if anything, like someone absorbing a blow he'd decided in advance not to fight. 2 weeks later, her assistant, a sharp, quietly observant young analyst named Priya Menon, brought her something that made the discomfort sharpen into something closer to alarm. Priya had been running a routine audit of facilities' incident reports, cross-referencing them against maintenance logs, when she noticed that the burst pipe report, the one that had gotten Gary Holt fired, didn't actually match the timeline it claimed to. The leak had been reported, through internal channels, 4 hours earlier than the incident report suggested. The original report, buried under 3 layers of resubmission, bore Pete Doyle's supervisor sign-off, time-stamped at a point that made it clear he'd sat on the information for hours before it ever reached facilities. "I don't think your night cleaner did anything wrong," Priya said, laying the timeline across Claire's desk. "I think somebody needed a person to blame, and he happened to be standing there." It was a small crack, but it widened fast. Because once Claire started looking at Pete Doyle's paperwork with real suspicion instead of routine trust, She found what Eleanor's auditors had spent a year failing to find. Not because Claire was smarter than professional auditors, but because she now knew exactly which small, specific inconsistency to pull on, and pulling on one thread in a poorly built lie tends to unravel the rest of it fast. Disposal forms that didn't match resale listings. A maintenance budget with expenditures that trace back to shell vendors, registered at Pete Doyle's own home address. A pattern of blaming low-level staff, a warehouse temp here, a contractor there, and now a night cleaner, every single time an inconsistency threatened to surface. Claire sat with that discovery for a long time before she did anything about it. Because sitting beneath the professional alarm was something more personal and harder to look at directly. She had fired an innocent man, publicly, coldly, in front of witnesses, based on nothing but her own accumulated exhaustion and suspicion, and she had not once, in the moment, considered that the quiet man with the mop might have deserved 5 more seconds of her attention before she ended his employment in front of half the lobby. She tried to find him. It was harder than she expected. The cleaning contractor's records for Gary Holt led to a phone number that had been disconnected the day after his termination, an address that turned out to be a mail drop Eleanor had arranged for exactly this kind of contingency, a paper trail that dead-ended everywhere Claire pushed against it, because Eleanor Harrison had built the cover identity to withstand casual scrutiny, not a determined CEO with something to prove to herself. It was around this same time, and this part Claire would only understand fully much later, that a second crisis arrived that had nothing directly to do with Grant, and everything to do with how deep the rot Eleanor had sensed actually went. A safety inspector flagged a structural issue at the company's largest regional warehouse, a load-bearing rack system that had been failing routine inspections for over a year, with the failed reports quietly reclassified as resolved pending documentation by a regional manager who, it would turn out, reported directly into the same network Pete Doyle had been protecting. Nobody had been hurt yet, but 340 employees worked shifts under that rack system every week, and the report sitting unresolved on a desk somewhere was not a hypothetical anymore. It was an active, ticking liability that could become a tragedy with no warning at all. It was an old argument in this company, whispered in break rooms and loading docks for longer than either woman in the story had been paying attention to it, whether the people who built something with their hands, year after year, floor after floor, actually understood it better than the credentialed people brought in afterward to manage it on paper. Claire had spent 18 months believing, mostly, that data and discipline could see what experience alone might miss. She was about to learn how wrong that assumption could be when it wasn't paired with somebody who'd actually walked the floors. Eleanor, watching all of this unfold from a careful distance, finally decided the waiting had gone on long enough. She called Grant on a Sunday evening, Emma's laughter audible in the background of the call, and said only, "It's time. She's already circling the truth. Better she hears the rest of it from us than stumbles into it and thinks we hid it from her out of something worse than grief and strategy." Grant agreed, finally, though something in his voice, something Eleanor recognized because she had heard it in her own voice once, decades earlier, in the year after her husband died, and she'd had to decide whether to keep building the company alone or let it fold quietly into something smaller and safer. Suggested he wasn't only thinking about the investigation anymore. He was thinking, too, about a woman who had fired him without knowing his name, and about the strange, unwelcome fact that some part of him wanted her to know the truth not for the company's sake, but for hers. 1 month later, on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, Eleanor Harrison walked into Claire Whitmore's office, closed the door behind her, and said the sentence that would change everything neither woman had said out loud yet. "I need to tell you who Gary Holt really is." Claire listened to the entire story without interrupting once, which was not, Eleanor would later tell Grant, something she had ever seen the woman do in 18 months of board meetings. She listened to the account of a rotting pension fund and vanishing equipment, of a founder who trusted almost no one left in the building enough to hand them the investigation directly, of a son who had walked away from the company 7 years earlier, under the weight of a grief nobody at Harrison Industrial had ever been told the full shape of, and who had come back only when his mother told him real people's retirements were on the line. When Eleanor finished, Claire sat very still for a long moment, her hands flat on the desk, and then she asked the only question that mattered to her in that instant, the one that had nothing to do with corporate fraud at all. "Does he hate me?" "He hasn't said a word about you," Eleanor said, which was true, and which told Claire almost nothing, and which was, in its own way, the most honest answer Eleanor could have given her. What followed over the next several weeks was not the triumphant unmasking either woman might have imagined lying awake at night. It was slower than that, and more procedural, because the fraud itself still had to be proven cleanly enough to survive legal scrutiny, and because Grant, once Claire reached out to him directly, once he agreed cautiously to meet her in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the headquarters he used to run pilot programs inside of, made it clear from the first conversation that he had no interest in a public spectacle of vindication. He wanted the fraud exposed properly. He wanted the pension fund made whole. He did not particularly want an apology, though Claire gave him one anyway, sitting across a small round table, with her hands wrapped around a coffee she never drank, telling him plainly that she had let exhaustion and suspicion do the job her judgment should have done, and that she was sorry, specifically and without qualification, for the lobby, for the badge, for not asking a single follow-up question before ending his employment in front of witnesses. Grant accepted the apology the way he accepted most things, quietly, without theater, and then he did something that surprised her more than the apology had surprised him. He offered to help her finish what Eleanor had started him on, not as the returning heir not yet, but as the man who had spent 11 weeks learning the building's rot from the inside, better than any external auditor ever could. Together, over the following weeks, they built the case that would end Pete Doyle's career and unravel the network beneath him. Grant's knowledge was granular in a way Claire's data teams couldn't replicate. He knew which loading dock cameras had blind spots because he'd mopped beneath them, knew which supervisors clocked out early because he'd watched the badge logs for 11 weeks, knew the specific serial number format Harrison Industrial used for equipment tagging well enough to match 6 missing laptops to resale listings within an afternoon. Something a forensic accounting firm had spent 4 months and $200,000 failing to do. Claire, in turn, had the institutional authority and the legal grounding to turn Grant's granular knowledge into something that would hold up. Subpoenaing vendor records, freezing Doyle's regional purchasing authority, pulling together the safety inspector's buried warehouse report, and matching its falsified resolved status against the actual, still failing rack system that was one bad shift away from injuring someone. The confrontation with Pete Doyle, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its speed. Faced with matched serial numbers, shell vendor addresses tracing to his own home, and a safety report he'd personally reclassified against an inspector's written objection, Doyle did not fight the evidence so much as collapse under the weight of it, offering first denial, then a series of smaller and smaller lies. Then finally, in a conference room with legal counsel present, a full account of 18 months spent systematically funneling company assets through a network of 3 regional managers who had, between them, cost Harrison Industrial an estimated $11 million, and had, far more dangerously, buried a structural safety issue that could have killed someone. It was in the middle of this unraveling, 3 days before the board was scheduled to meet and formally review the findings, that Claire finally said the thing she'd been circling for weeks. Standing in the same lobby where she'd fired him, the marble floor dry now, the chandelier throwing its ordinary evening light across both of them. "I keep thinking about how long I would have let this go on if you hadn't been in that supply closet the day I decided to hate you for it." She wasn't looking at him when she said it. "I don't know what to do with that, or with you, honestly. You could walk into this building tomorrow as the heir to everything I've been trying to run, and I fired you like you were nobody." "You didn't know," Grant said. "That's not the same as it not mattering," Claire said, and something in her voice, the particular exhaustion he'd noticed months ago through the glass of her office door, still there, but threaded now with something rawer, made Grant understand, for the first time, that the coldness he'd cataloged in her during 11 weeks of quiet observation had never been the whole story, any more than the mop and the false name had ever been the whole story of him. Neither of them said anything else that evening. But 3 days later, In front of the full board of Harrison Industrial Group, Eleanor Harrison stood at the head of the table and did the thing she had promised herself she would do the moment the investigation was airtight. She told the entire board, in full, exactly who Gary Holt really was, exactly what he had uncovered, and exactly what she intended to do about the succession question the company had been quietly avoiding for 7 years. 6 months would pass before the full weight of that boardroom announcement finished settling, not into scandal, but into something the company had genuinely never had before, a leadership structure built on truth instead of convenient silence. The board meeting that followed Eleanor's announcement was, by any normal corporate standard, chaos. Questions about liability, about disclosure timing, about whether a secret internal investigation exposed the company to legal risk it hadn't anticipated. But underneath the procedural noise was a simpler fact that even the most skeptical board members couldn't argue with. An $11 million fraud had been stopped. A warehouse full of employees had been protected from a structural failure that inspectors now confirmed could have caused serious injury within weeks, and a pension fund that 300 families depended on had been fully restored, with interest, before a single retiree ever knew it had been at risk. Claire Whitmore stood in front of that same board 2 weeks later and did something almost nobody in her position would have chosen to do. She could have framed the entire investigation as her own initiative, could have folded Grant's contribution into the broader story of her leadership, could have protected her own reputation with the same instinct for self-preservation that had kept her up at night for 18 months. Instead, she told the board plainly that the fraud had been uncovered because Eleanor Harrison's son had spent 11 weeks working nights as a janitor, with more diligence and insight than the company's own executive layer had managed in years, and that she herself had fired him publicly, wrongly, based on assumptions she should have questioned. It cost her something real to say it. A flicker of doubt crossed 2 board members' faces, the kind of doubt that could, in a worse political climate, have ended a CEO's tenure. She said it anyway, because the alternative was a version of leadership built on the same convenient silence that had let Pete Doyle operate for a year and a half. And she had decided, somewhere in the last 2 months, that she would rather be honest and vulnerable than safe and complicit. The board in the end respected her more for it, not less. Eleanor made sure of that too, standing beside Claire in that meeting, telling the board in plain terms that a CEO willing to admit an error publicly, in front of the people who could fire her for it, was exactly the kind of leader the company needed going forward. More in some ways than a founder's son who had spent 7 years away from the building. That set up the offer, when it came a week later, that Grant declined. Eleanor wanted to install him as CEO immediately, to hand him the title and the office and the 7 years of ground he'd lost, wrapped in a public announcement that would have made the story of the wronged heir into the triumphant centerpiece of the company's next quarter. Grant said no gently, the way he said most things. He didn't want the title. He wanted a seat on the board, enough authority to make sure a pension fund could never be quietly raided again. And this was the part that surprised his mother most. He wanted Claire Whitmore to stay exactly where she was, running the company day to day, because in 11 weeks of watching her through the glass of her office door, and in 2 months of working alongside her to unravel Pete Doyle's fraud, he had come to believe, with a certainty he hadn't expected, that she was better at the job than he had ever been, or ever wanted to be again. "I have a 6-year-old who needs me home for dinner," he told his mother, and that was most of the truth, though not quite all of it. The quiet coda came 4 months later, on an evening in early autumn, at a small gathering Eleanor insisted on hosting at her house rather than the office. No press, no board, just family and the small circle of people who'd actually lived through the last year of the company's slow, honest repair. Emma, 7 now, ran across Eleanor's lawn in a dress with grass stains already forming at the hem, chasing a dog that belonged to no one in particular, while Grant stood near the porch, with Claire beside him, both of them holding drinks neither was really drinking, watching the light go gold and then gray over the yard. "I still have the old badge," Claire said, out of nowhere, half a smile in it. "Gary Holt's. I kept it in my desk drawer. I don't know why." "Guilt," Grant said, without much weight behind it. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe I liked having proof that I was wrong about somebody once in a way that turned out okay in the end. She looked at him, and there was none of the coldness left in it, none of the exhausted suspicion from that first morning in the lobby. I don't think I'd have found any of it without you. The fraud, or, she didn't finish the sentence, and didn't need to. They married the following spring, in a ceremony small enough that Emma was allowed to walk the aisle scattering flower petals with the same chaotic enthusiasm she brought to everything, and Eleanor Harrison sat in the front row holding a badge with the name Gary Holt printed on it, which Claire had asked to be framed and displayed, discreetly, in the lobby where it had all gone wrong, not as a trophy but as a reminder, to herself and to anyone who ever glanced at it, that the quietest person in a room is sometimes the only one who has actually taken the time to see what's really happening inside it. If there's someone in your own life who was ever misjudged the way Grant was, dismissed, underestimated, or written off before anyone bothered to ask a single real question about who they were, we would love for you to tell us about them in the comments, even if all you can offer now is the credit they never got at the time. And if you believe, the way this story does, that quiet, overlooked people deserve to be truly seen, we'd be glad to have you stay part of this story with us, subscribed for the next one. Because in the end, the badge in that lobby case doesn't say janitor, and it doesn't say heir, either. It just says a name that once meant nothing to the people walking past it every day, and now means everything to the two people who finally stopped, for just long enough, to ask who was really standing behind the mop.